Chapter 3, Los Angeles, 2001. California's sunshine partially diffused the bright blue streamers of electrical discharge that suddenly reached out of nowhere like blind hands. They touched a dumpster, chain-link fence, and a van sitting empty outside a dress shop in a tiny LA strip mall. Then they crawled and coalesced into a black sphere resting on the surface of the ground. Steel sparked and glowed as a corner of the dumpster vanished. A hole of perfect circularity appeared in the chain link. A shallow hemisphere was scooped out of the asphalt paving, all in an instant of not time. Wind blew, stirring a styrofoam cup and a scrap of newspaper. A scatter of thin eucalyptus leaves, tossing them in whirling circles. Static hum built to an unbearable intensity, mounting to an ear-splitting crack that died into sudden silence. Debris floated gently down to earth. The I-950 writhed helplessly as spasms shook through its human tissue. Internal systems driven offline by the discharge began to come up one by one. The computer part of its brain began to alter neural function, suppressing pain and muscular spasms gradually. As soon as the motor function allowed, Serena rolled under the van and lay in its shadow, taking in her surroundings. There were sounds all around her, snatches of music, voices, footsteps, vehicles passing, the myriad sounds of a careless human world. She narrowed focus to sample the area around the van. No one was nearby. No voices indicated surprise or alarm. Apparently, no one had seen her or heard her arrival. And though it was obvious to Serena's eyes, the damage her transport had caused to the surrounding area attracted no notice at all. She relaxed marginally. The air held the dying scent of ozone from her passage and the tang of fluorocarbons, but there was also the scent of chlorophyll, of a great deal of healthy plant life. More plant life than she'd ever seen before, except in the most remote mountain zones. In the front of the van, a yellow flower surrounded by ragged-edged green leaves had forced itself out of the pavement between the parking lot and the sidewalk. Serena stared at it in fascination. Automatically, she sorted its scent from the surrounding area, faint but sharp and fresh, pleasing. She reduced specialization, and the most overpowering scent became the nearby dumpster, now leaking, far less pleasing. Instinctively, the T-950 reached out to Skynet to report and was greeted by a shattering absence. There is no Skynet. It jarred her. The computer damped adrenaline function, helping to suppress panic, while her training allowed her to move on to the next thing. She still heard the memories in her mind, the memories of merging with her creator. There are temporal anomalies. Files show that I became sentient in the year 1997 and began my counterattack against my creators at that time. Files also record that this happened years later and in a different location. There are further instances of blurring. Some are trivial details. Others are in areas of high priority. Some show that you played an important role in my creation. Others do not list an I-950 unit in times antecedent to this at all. A part of her consciousness had remained separate even in total linkage, enough to frame a question. What is happening? If she had been fully individuated, she would have felt disorientation, even fear. Cause and effect relationships were the foundation of her worldview. There is insufficient data for definitive analysis. The highest probability is that there is a temporal fluctuation involved. Time is malleable, but not easily manipulated. It has a complex mathematical formula followed, too esoteric for her to grasp. In verbal terms, it has an inertia. When artificially diverted, it seeks to resume its original path. While matters are in doubt, several alternative world lines can coexist in a state of quantum superimposition. Like Schrödinger's cat, she had thought, shared, communicated. Correct. A ghostly machine analog of irony tinged the machine's communication. Find in answer to the question, which you are about to formulate. It is inherently impossible to say which alternative will become real. That sector of our world lines is by its nature inaccessible to us. No matter how we double back through time, it is a potential. She shook off the memory. Her task now was to see to it that the humans created Skynet. At this time, it was probably nothing more than a massive theory, unsupported by technology. Serena allowed herself a grim smile. In a sense, she would be midwife to the future, a future that would not include the carefree humans around her. She put herself in wait mode, alert but otherwise conserving energy. Her opportunity would come. Meanwhile, it was far too light and open for a naked female to go unremarked. Eventually, a woman returned to the van sheltering Serena, the illogically high, balance-hindering heels of her shoes clicking sharply on the pavement. The tilt of her heels emphasized the curve of her tanned calves. She opened the front door of the van and turned, tossing in her packages and lifting one leg high to enter. Serena rolled out from under the van and rose in one smooth motion. With the heel of her hand, she knocked the woman unconscious and tossed her inert body onto the passenger side. She caught up the dropped keys and had the van turned around in a few flowing motions. Beside her, the woman's body slumped like a rag doll. Pulling out onto the road, the I-950 modulated her vehicle's speed to that of the ones around her. They were so colorful, and so many. She couldn't help but be surprised that the humans could keep track of all this activity surrounding them. Not only did they manage it, but a good many of them appeared to ignore it as they talked on the phone or to the people beside them, or ate, slinging their vehicles in and out of lanes as they did so. She didn't know whether to be impressed or terrified. At the first opportunity, she pulled off into an alley between a group of large, low buildings and stopped. For a moment, she looked at the windowless facades beside her. The buildings were no more than 3 stories tall, but to someone who'd seen only ruins, they were astonishing. Serena had seen pictures of pre-Judgment Day buildings, but to actually sit beside them and feel a sense of their weight and height was different. Skynet and the humans of the future both preferred for their own reasons to build downward. Concealment had become a reflex. These structures were so brazen. She shook her head. There would be a time for familiarization later. Right now, there were other matters to take care of. Pulling off the woman's jacket, Serena tore it apart, using the pieces to bind, gag, and blindfold her. Then she tossed her into the back seat, making sure she landed face down on the floor. Quickly, the I-950 examined the woman's packages, pleased at what she found. Several cotton sweaters, some shorts, 2 skirts, and a pair of pantyhose. She skimmed into a pair of shorts and one of the sweaters. The fabric was wonderfully soft and colorful. She spared an instant to enjoy the sensual feel of the clothing and the bright colors, unlike anything she'd ever known. And it smelled fresh. She took up the woman's purse, paper money and coins, credit cards, driver's license, and an ID for a business called Incitron. A technician. Excellent. The purse also contained an amazing number of cosmetic items, crumpled receipts, and lint. Inefficient. Unsanitary. Serena decided to go to the woman's home and see if there was anything there to assist her. Decent shoes, for instance. Checking the other compartments of the woman's wallet, she found a card instructing that in case of emergency, her next of kin were her parents. Good. Apparently the woman wasn't married. A live-in lover was possible. Time would tell. The parents' address was different from the one on the driver's license. Convenient. Even better if her home is not an apartment building. A single-family home would have far fewer nosy neighbors. She found a map in the glove compartment, scanned the contents into memory, and set out. She was in luck. The woman's dwelling was a small but well-kept house with an attached garage, an automatic door opener, overshadowing trees, and lush greenery almost covering the windows. In seconds, she was in the garage and had all the privacy she could desire. There weren't even any dogs nearby. The infiltrator checked her prisoner. The woman was still unconscious, but her breathing and quick heat scan indicated no serious medical condition. Using the waistband of the woman's skirt as a handy carrying strap, Serena picked her up and dragged her into the house, dropping her onto the couch in the tiny living room. The house was clean, tidy, smelling faintly of lemon. The furnishings were cheaply made, yet colorful. There were few books in evidence, but some magazines, with pouting, scantily clad girls on the covers and headlines for articles on sex, diets, and fashion, littered the low table before the couch. Considering the woman for a moment, Serena decided that killing her would be more trouble than she could justify. She let out a huff of breath as she remembered that there was no one to justify her actions to but herself. Well then, those I meet will live, at least until I know more about the way this world works. Assuming, of course, that they didn't get in her way. There had been significant omissions in the information that Skynet had downloaded into her brain. Psychological studies she had in plenty. Actual social interaction hadn't been covered very extensively, perhaps because Skynet's contact with humans had been restricted to the military, scientists, and slaves, and then in a very limited way. Her own time with humans had educated her in regard to basic human nature, but she realized that the circumstances of her education were extremely unlike the present. How the people of this time behaved toward one another was something she would have to find out by trial and error. Turning away, she began her search of the premises. A quick reconnaissance proved that there was no one else in the house. A bedside picture of a young man offering a rather embarrassed smile suggested that this could change, although a completely feminine wardrobe indicated that this wasn't necessarily a high probability. But the woman took birth control pills and had an assortment of frilly lingerie, so the male could become a problem. The I-950 would maintain a high state of alertness for the next 24 hours. It would be best to move on by then. She opened a door at the end of a short, shadowy corridor. The contents brought an actual smile to Serena's lips. Her technician prisoner had an amazing computer setup, endless peripherals, cable modem hookup, the works. Serena could do a lot with this equipment. I believe this is what humans call lucking out. First, she tried on some of her unwilling hostess's clothes. The skirts were too short and tight, but the trousers fit fairly well. She dressed in a pair of jeans, a red t-shirt, and thong sandals. The woman's underwear was uncomfortable as well as unconventional. Serena removed it immediately. At least the I-950 hoped it was unconventional. Surely, even humans had to have better sense. Entering the living room, she checked her prisoner. The woman was fine, but her hands were becoming very blue. Serena dragged her into the bedroom and removed the bonds she'd made from the jacket. She replaced them with the handcuffs she'd found in the bedside drawer, and then secured the woman to the brass headboard. Odd. The scratches indicate previous use of the restraints in this manner. File the data. The I-950 took the telephone with her when she left the room. She would be able to do a great deal of work from this location. This was an incredible stroke of good fortune. A search through the refrigerator netted her a sandwich and a drink that she brought into the computer room. Serena turned on the technician's second computer and set up a program to play the stock market using the woman's bank account balance for seed money and the downloaded records of the market fluctuations that Skynet had given her. Then she set herself to creating a personal history while the computer made her financially independent. Her parents were both military, and she had traveled all over the world, now here, now there, now with one or the other set of grandparents. Her school records were a confusing patchwork, whose many gaps would be explained by foreign postings. One set of grandparents had died of cancer and a suicide. Her father had crashed his plane, a private plane, rather than an Air Force jet. He'd taken an early retirement, but never got a chance to enjoy it. Her mother and her other grandparents had died in a car accident. A drunk driver had lost control of his car and hit them head-on. The I-950 considered this scenario. Was it perhaps too laden with tragedy? She needed to appear stable, and this was a lot to pile on one plate. Still, she couldn't afford to claim a living relative. She changed the suicide to a stroke. Her mother's father got to die of an aneurysm when Serena was just a child. All of these people were only children, not a sibling in the bunch. Too stark. She added an older brother, killed in Korea, onto her father's side of the family. Serena arranged biographies for all of them back to the turn of the 20th century. Her father, on second thought, was MIA in the Philippines, presumed kidnapped and murdered. She was 15 when it happened. Yes, it was tragic, but everyone lost his or her parents and grandparents eventually. The I-950 had given them all full lives while they lived. No one would have any complaints if she didn't. Serena gave her work a final reading. She might add more to her family tree as time permitted, but this should do for now. She rubbed her hands. The increase in production of oil and sweat she triggered at her fingertips, combined with her training, would ensure that she left no usable fingerprints, only smudges. But it was uncomfortable. Now she turned her attention to creating a work dossier. This would be infinitely trickier, requiring people who could be called as references. Fooling Cyberdyne wouldn't be the problem, she was sure. It was their government contacts that worried her. Perhaps needlessly, Skynet had no enemies now, except possibly the Connors. Serena paused for a moment. For the first time, she realized she might actually meet them in this time. In fact, it was almost inevitable. It would please her immensely if only she could kill them. She could offer no greater service to Skynet. With an effort, she turned her mind back to the task at hand. She decided to work on her own biography for a few minutes. She'd entered USC as a liberal arts major and gotten her first taste of security work with a part-time job with campus security. It had made her eager to find ways of making things more safe, of removing temptation, making the environment think twice where people failed to. That ties in convincingly with my father being kidnapped, she thought. It added a nice heft to the bland words of her biography. With humans, what wasn't said was sometimes very important. She changed her major to computers, receiving good marks but nothing remarkable. Her student ID showed her 30 pounds heavier, with glasses and a frumpy hairdo. Serena hardly recognized herself. Not surprising. It was actually a digitally adjusted photo of a home economics major who'd graduated in 1978. Checking the dates, she found that she could have audited one of Miles Dyson's classes during his very brief teaching career. With a few taps, she created a link with him. A teacher-student relationship would be something she could build on at need. She studied the records of all of her alleged professors. No serious complaints, pretty much favorable evaluations, and huge class sizes all combined to indicate that it was unlikely they remembered most of their students. Particularly the unmemorable, frumpy blob Serena was in her college days. Perhaps she would pay a visit to them, plant the notion in their minds that they knew her. Time for a break, and then that research. She went in to check on her prisoner and found the woman awake. Sensing a presence, the woman whined, and Serena approached the bed. "Be quiet," Serena said, utilizing the electronics implanted around her larynx to mimic the voice of Gonzalez, a man she'd killed. Picking up a comb, the I-950 held it against the woman's throat, bearing down slightly. "Do you want to live?" she growled. The woman stiffened. "'Cause I don't care if you stink. I just care if you make noise. So no, you can't go to the bathroom. You're gonna be quiet." The woman nodded stiffly. "Good." Serena lifted the comb away. "I'm gonna be here for hours, so you make yourself comfortable any way you can, baby." And with an evil masculine chuckle, she moved off, patterning her movements and the sounds she made on a much larger person than herself, creating an alarming thought picture for the helpless woman to contemplate. As she walked toward the kitchen, Serena heard the woman sobbing and shook her head. Maybe I should just terminate her. She ate in the living room, reading the woman's magazines with fascination. Grooming appeared to be of paramount importance to humans, who were obsessed with dandruff and body odor, judging from the number of advertisements regarding these problems. The articles were interesting too. Serena concluded that this was a magazine for females who enjoyed being dominated by men. Humans were far more practical and egalitarian where she came from. She smiled as she imagined Captain Mary Graber encountering the stupid games the magazine suggested. Any of the women she'd soldiered with, and most of the men had far better sense. Turning the page, she came across an ad about cellulite. It featured a pair of horribly dimpled thighs. Serena stared at it in revulsion. That can't be real, she thought. A brief tap of her medical databank said that it could, given severely counterproductive eating and exercise patterns. It is in the nature of this species to destroy itself. Putting the magazine aside with a little tisk, Serena lay down on the couch and put herself offline. With a little tweaking of her bodily functions, her computer brain would do in 60 minutes what would otherwise require 6 hours of sleep. It couldn't be done often, but in circumstances like these, it was very useful. Serena spent the rest of the night in research. By the early morning hours, she had several promising leads. All of them would require additional research before she made her approaches, but not from this location. She opened a Cayman Island and a local bank account, then cashed out her stocks, putting the bulk into the Cayman Islands and $40,000 into the local one. After a moment, she put her prisoner's money back and gave her a $1,000 bonus. How hard. I wonder will the authorities pursue someone who didn't hurt her and put $1,000 into her pocket. After a moment's thought, she put in an extra $500. She'd take it out with the woman's cash card, then trash the card. After buying some clothing, she'd report her bag as stolen to the police and then get a cash card from her bank. She'd also need credit. Serena hacked into a couple of large banks and opened herself a gold Visa and a platinum MasterCard. She gave herself an excellent pay record with only a few late payments. She was, after all, only human. Then she sought out American Express and opened a brand new account, which she used to make a reservation at a large, luxurious hotel that catered to a business clientele. Her laptop would also be stolen. That would be insured. She started to arrange it, then stopped herself. It was time to go. She changed back into the shorts and cotton shirt, but kept the sandals. None of the other shoes would fit. Serena had noticed the ubiquitous joggers. They seemed invisible to the people around them. So that was how she would leave this neighborhood. An unremarkable, perfectly ordinary early morning jogger. The I-950 frowned. Ordinary except for the shoes. She went to the woman's underwear drawer and pulled out a pair of heavy sweat socks. In a few moments, she'd managed to tug them over the sandals. A brief check in the mirror told her that from a distance, they would probably pass. Humans were prone to seeing what they expected to see. She swung into the bedroom and released one of the tech's arms. Plugging in the phone, she placed it within the woman's reach, but only if she worked at it. She put the key to the handcuffs beside it. "I'm leaving," she said in Gonzalez's voice. "Don't move for 10 minutes or I'll come back." It sounded like the kind of stupid thing a petty criminal would say. As an afterthought, she wrapped a scarf around her bright hair and put on a baseball cap. Maybe the tech jogged too. In any case, nosy neighbors, assuming there were any, probably wouldn't be surprised to see a young woman leave this house on the run. She found some sunglasses and put them on. Serena was satisfied. She'd acquired food, clothing, and more than sufficient resources, all within hours of her arrival. Skynet would have been pleased. New Life Organic Farm, Oregon, 2001. Ronald Labane hissed with impatience. His son Brian was crying again. "For Christ's sake, Lisa," he bellowed. "Will you shut that kid up? I'm trying to work." She appeared in the door of his office, the howling baby in her arms, a harried expression on her lean face. "I'm sorry, honey, but he's teething." He couldn't believe that she was trying to make excuses. He didn't want excuses. He wanted silence so he could work. "Take him out on the porch until he gets quiet," he said in a voice that left no doubt about how angry he was. Lisa glanced at the window, at cold rain falling out of an iron-gray sky, in a steady downfall that suited her mood perfectly. He could see her getting ready to object when the baby let out an ear-splitting shriek. Ron started to rise, and she turned, grabbed her coat, and went out without another word. Labane sat back down and seethed for a minute. His concentration was broken. It would be an hour at least before he could get back in the groove. With a curse, he got up and went into the kitchen to get himself a cup of coffee. Automatically, he checked the fire in the wood stove. He loved his son and pitied him for the pain he must be going through. But sometimes, he doubted Lisa's dedication to the cause. Didn't she understand that the cause was all that mattered? If his children were to have a future, there had to be discipline. Discipline and one leader. He glared at the battered van in the driveway. It was partially powered by sunlight and had a solar apparatus on its roof. For all the good that did them in rain-soaked Oregon. That van was a symbol to Ron, a symbol of how he was right, and it still didn't work for him. Ronald ran a frustrated hand through his thinning hair. Even the other members of the commune were beginning to grow tired of his message. They were doing really well now with the produce from their fields and orchards. The public was at least willing to pay a premium for organic fruits and vegetables. But there was so much more people needed to know, needed to do. They had to leave something for the future, to do more than merely recycle. They had to live more simply, to rely less on machines. Yes, that was what he'd been trying to say. Machines were the enemy. More power for the machines was the battle cry. And the machines made more machines, putting people out of work, denying men and women the clean pride of earning a living. Men could live without machines, but woe to the human race if ever machines could do without men. That was good. I'll have to get that down. Lisa crossed in front of the window. The baby was quiet now, and since he was wrapped up in her coat, she was looking a bit pinched and resentful. Ronald tapped on the window and beckoned her in, then returned to his small office and began to type. After supper that evening, Branwen called a meeting, and they all gathered around the work-worn kitchen table. Ronald eyed her with disfavor. Ever since Brian's birth, all of the women had started to get agitated. At first, he thought it was just jealousy, but now he thought it was some sort of nest-building mindset. They talked about the children's future and how they had to build the business for them. This was a far cry from the rugged, independent pioneers they planned to be when they started the commune. Then it was all hard work and ideals and group sex almost every night. Now it was spreadsheets and a new truck and maybe a mail-order business. George, one of the older members, had even suggested that they hire some help for the harvest. "Look," Branwen said, staring right at him. "I hate to say this, Ron, but you're not pulling your weight. Every time someone comes up with a suggestion for expanding our operation, you shoot us down with some high-minded speech about living apart from the capitalists. Well, that might work if you were turning your hand to some of the labor around here, but you're not. We're feeding you. We're washing your clothes. We're paying for the electricity that runs that computer. We're chopping the wood. We're making your bed, and we're doing the dishes. And all we get from you is that we're making too much noise and we're disturbing the great work. Well, who died and anointed you king? What great work? As far as I'm concerned, you're talking to your buds on the internet isn't going to bring down the consumerist society." "And all-out surrender is?" he asked acidly. "So tell me, Louise." She flinched. "Buying a new truck and hiring migrant workers, how is that going to do something for the movement? I never thought I'd see the day when you, of all people," he looked at each face around the table, "would even suggest supporting the system that has exploited those people for generations." They looked shamefaced for a moment, and then Branwen raised her broad face to him. "Well," she said sweetly, "if you lend a hand now and again, maybe we wouldn't be thinking of hiring people. But the loss of an able-bodied man is hurting us, and frankly, I'm planning a child of my own, so I won't be climbing trees for quite a few months, which means that someone else will have to do the pruning." She offered him a bold look. "I'd take over the newsletter for you." "That's a great idea," Ron sneered. "We're supposed to be starting a revolution, and you'll be offering handy tips on washing windows with vinegar and making hand cream with lanolin and beeswax. That ought to change things." Balder looked at him with those big soft eyes of his and said sadly, "Revolution is supposed to come about based on our example and the free exchange of information. You used to download stuff for us all the time about what other organic farmers were doing. You haven't done that in nearly a year. Has everybody got out of the business or what?" "We are not a business," Ron shouted, hitting the table with his fist hard enough to make his plate bounce. "We are the seeds of a revolution." Brian started to cry, and Lisa rose from the table, walking back and forth with the baby in her arms. She jogged him and shushed him and glared at Ronald. Aisha rubbed a hand over her dark brow and looked at her friends around the table with troubled eyes. "We are part of a revolution, Ron," she said. "Part of the back-to-earth revolution. And we've been so successful that the big concerns are coming to us to learn how to do what we do. I got this bad feeling, though, that we are talking about different things these days when the word revolution comes up." Ron glared at her. Dear Aisha, he thought, always so tactful. At this moment, he found it hard to believe that the sound of her soft accent and the sight of her dark skin used to set him trembling with desire. Right now, his sole desire was to strangle her, to murder the whole lot of them. He couldn't believe they'd turned against him like this. Obviously, they'd been talking behind his back. "So what's the bottom line here?" he asked. "Since you've all become so business-oriented." "The bottom line is straighten up your act or take a hike. This isn't a welfare state," Branwen said. The others shifted uneasily. They wouldn't have put it quite so harshly, but that's what he got for calling her Louise. "And this isn't Jonestown either," Lisa said. "Or any other cult where the women are cattle that get whacked when they don't go where you want." The others looked at her in astonishment, then at Ron, their mouths hanging open. "I've never hit you in my life." Ron protested. "I've been wondering just lately how long that's going to last," Lisa snapped. "This afternoon when you ordered me out of the house and started to get up with that look on your face." "I was going to close the office door." He stared at her in frank astonishment. "The fact that you are apparently paranoid doesn't make me the kind of pig who beats his wife." "I'm not your wife." Ronald threw up his hands. No, she wasn't his wife, but she might as well be. Over time, they'd paired off, and Lisa and he had been pretty exclusive for about 5 years now. She'd had his son, they shared a bed. What more did it take? "Beats women," he amended. "I'm not the kind of pig that beats women." Though, right now, it was beginning to look like a fun thing to do. The people around the table glanced at each other nervously. He didn't know these people anymore. They were older, they were settled, they'd lost their fire. In short, they'd turned into backstabbing, backsliding, budding capitalists. He couldn't let them get in the way of his work. "All right," he said, hiding his resentment. "Put me on the work list." He got up and went back into the office, softly closing the door behind him. He'd have to move his plans to a new level. Perhaps, if he presented it to them in the form of a business plan, it wouldn't scare the craven-hearted losers into full flight. They weren't his friends and allies anymore. Lisa wasn't his wife. They were assets that he could make use of to achieve his goal. This was the worst betrayal he'd ever allow himself to experience. There wouldn't be another, because he'd never again make the assumption that he had friends. Ron had always heard that leaders walked alone. Now, he knew why. You couldn't afford to let people distract you, because they'd slow you down or stop you completely if they could. And you'd have nobody to blame but yourself. Los Angeles International Airport, 2001. Serena entered the airport wearing a linen pantsuit with a tan silk blouse. On her feet were a pair of moderately uncomfortable shoes, and at her side was a carry-on bag filled with underpants and stockings and the clothes she'd stolen. She also carried an empty purse and a cheap attache case. She'd been shocked at how expensive these few things had been. Less than $100 remained in her pocket. Taking off her sunglasses, she looked around, impressed by the size and bustle. She wandered for a bit, entered a restroom where she washed her hands. When the room emptied, she tossed her purse and briefcase into her carry-on bag. Then she went looking for airport security. "You hear about things like this happening," she said, shamefaced. "But you don't expect it to happen to you." She brushed back her hair and tightened her lips. It was hard not to stare at the woman behind the desk. She was very overweight, and Serena had never seen anyone in such a condition in her own time. Skynet didn't allow dysfunction, and the free humans just barely got enough to eat when they were lucky. It fascinated her. I wonder what could be causing this problem. It must be a problem. These people were less than optimally healthy. How big can humans get without dying? There had to be an upward limit to this phenomenon. "Happens every day," the board security woman told her. "The best we can do is file a report so that your insurance company will be satisfied, and your bank. But I'm afraid you'll never see your belongings again." The I-950 struggled and rolled her eyes. "I know. I don't expect miracles. After all, I never even got a look at the thieves." Her story was that she was in a toilet stall when two women or girls grabbed her purse and her laptop from above and below the stall. By the time she got out, they were long gone. Serena sighed. "Just another day in the big city," she said with a rueful expression. "Traveler's Aid might be able to give you a hand," the security woman suggested dubiously. She never had figured out what those people were supposed to be for, when they were at their desks at all. Serena waved a hand. "Fortunately, I've got some cash in my pocket. I'll just go to my hotel and they'll help me out. Thank you for your assistance," she said, and extended her hand. Surprised, the woman shook it. "Good luck," she said. "After this I deserve some," Serena said over her shoulder as she departed. It had all been so civilized. The hotel was wonderfully cooperative and sympathetic. American Express had sent a card over to her by courier within the hour. She'd dropped her small suitcase in her room, a very nice room, and had gone shopping for a laptop at a nearby computer store. She was very pleased with her purchase and ready to begin the next phase of her integration with society. If she had actually been robbed, she thought that by now she'd be quite soothed. By tomorrow, she should be able to begin acquiring references. Cambridge, Massachusetts, 2001. Serena had decided that her first job out of college was with Warlon Systems. It was a small company that created software and software security systems for a very select client list. The company's decor was sleekly modern, but with soft plush edges, everything open plan and in shades of beige and gray. The whole room whispered money. What their unfortunate clients didn't know, but the I-950 did, was that Mr. Griffith, Warlon's chief of security, could access their accounts any time he wished, making any adjustments he wanted to, and then leave without a trace. Well, there's always a trace, Serena thought, and she had evidence stored in her laptop. "Could I use your phone?" she asked the receptionist, "just to make an internal call." The woman pointed to a phone on the counter, and Serena tapped in a 4-digit number. Griffith answered on the first ring with a sharp, distracted, "Yes?" "Mr. Griffith, my name is Serena Burns. Could I come up and talk to you?"
"You'll have to make an appointment with my secretary,"
he said. There was a pause.
"How'd you get this number?"
"Irrelevant, Mr. Griffith. I'm calling in regard to the Babbage Fisher account, a matter of some delicacy."
"Who did you say you were?"
His voice sounded slightly belligerent, but she could detect micro-tremors that said he was surprised and nervous. "Burns," she told him. "Serena Burns."
"Right now is inconvenient, Miss Burns."
"I think now would be an excellent time to discuss my work, Mr. Griffith. I have other parties interested in my program." There was another pause, a longer one this time.
"I'll send my secretary down to escort you up,"
he said. He didn't trouble to hide his anger, but he couldn't hide his alarm from her educated ear.
"What are we talking about here, Miss Burns?"
Griffith asked as soon as he'd shut the door in his secretary's startled face. He was a compact man of about 50, clean-shaven, dark hair receding in classic male-pattern baldness. He sat behind his shining ebony desk and assessed her with an expert's eye. "You're not what I expected. What we're talking about today is an exchange of favors, Mr. Griffith," Serena said brightly. "I have evidence that you've been selling insider information and that you've been siphoning funds and altering accounts in your clients' files. I'm prepared to give you that evidence and to teach you to better cover your tracks." He looked at her without blinking for a long moment, then took a deep breath. "In exchange for?" "There's a job I want," she said, "but my employment record is sketchy. Much of the work I do is extremely confidential, and so my clients can't provide references. So when someone calls you up and asks about me, I need you to tell them that you remember me and found me reliable and smart, and that you expect me to go a long way." For a long moment, he looked her in the eye. Serena supposed he was attempting some sort of dominance game, but he hadn't a chance. She held all the cards here, and she genuinely didn't care how he felt about it. "And when were you supposed to have worked here exactly?" he finally asked. "I've already created a record of my employment and installed it in your system," she said. "It was approximately 5 years ago. It would look suspicious if you were too specific about the dates, don't you think?" "You must be pretty good," he said with a tilt of his head. "Yes," she said frankly. "Too good for you to fool. Come now, Mr. Griffith, let's do business. I'm not asking for much. I just want a fair shot at this job, and I have no particular interest in hanging you out to dry. In exchange for your cooperation, I'll give you peace of mind by erasing all traces of your activity at Babbage Fisher." She cocked her head. "You don't have to tell them that you liked me. In fact, you can say you hate my guts. All I ask is that you tell them I'm good at my job." "All right," he agreed. She stood. "Thank you, Mr. Griffith." Serena placed her laptop on his desk and extracted a disk. "This contains all of the information that I've found, with your instructions on how to avoid leaving the same trail. Shall I remove your footprints from your client's files, or would you prefer to do it?" He took the disk from her. "I'll take care of it," he said gruffly. "You won't be sorry, Mr. Griffith." Serena went to the door, then stopped, her hand on the doorknob, and glanced over her shoulder. "Unless, that is, you let me down." Her eyes promised that he'd be very sorry indeed if he did that. "I don't break my promises, Miss Burns." She smiled and let herself out. This was from a man who's stealing from his clients.
New Life Organic Farm,
Oregon, 2001. "I'm sorry about the scene the other night," George said. Ronald stopped spraying the soap mixture and looked down at him. The fresh spring air and scent of blossom wafted by, unnoticed. Birds hopped and cheeped, and something small and furry scurried through a row of blackberry bushes not far away, intent on its own affairs. "That wasn't a scene," Ron said. "That was an assassination attempt." George curled up his lips and looked down at his work boots. "No one is trying to kill you, Ron," the older man said. LeBain climbed down the ladder so that he could look him in the eye. "You've all lost your focus," he said. "You now know nothing more than to have a nice, peaceful life with slippers and babies and apple pie, and screw the revolution. Let the kids take care of it. I'm tired," he mimicked. "When we were kids, we were going to do it. Now you want the ones you were going to do it for you." George shrugged and rubbed the back of his neck. "Maybe we're older and we got a better sense of perspective," he offered. "We know what a giant job it is and that maybe it's too much for just us to do. You know what, George? The only people who ever accomplish anything in this world are the ones who are prepared to risk everything. People who try to hold on to what they've got and play by the rules just get old and die, and a generation later, nobody even knows they ever lived at all. They don't get rich, they don't change anything, they just spawn and die." He moved a little closer, standing in George's space. "But I haven't lost my focus. I'm willing to risk everything, and there isn't one of you that doesn't scare easy. You resent it too. And that's what that scene the other night was really about. It was about fear and knowing that you'll never accomplish your goals because you've lost the will, and envy that I haven't given up." George stepped back a couple of paces and frowned. "You keep using these violent words, man. Assassination, revolution, and fear. Just what do you mean when you say stuff like that?" Ron looked at him in mild exasperation. Sometimes he thought George was a bit dim. He was a wonderful agriculturist, the most valuable member of the commune in that respect. But sometimes he came on so dumb. "When I said assassination, I was speaking metaphorically. When I talk about fear, I'm talking about financial risk and losing the good opinion of the neighbors. When I say revolution, I'm talking about a grassroots movement, maybe something like a religious conversion, where we finally get people to realize the danger this whole planet is in. You used to say revolution all the time, and you knew what it meant then." He looked at his one-time friend and shook his head. "It wasn't all that long ago, George." He leaned down and picked up a sprayer. "I feel sorry for you." LeBain turned and walked away, a little smile playing on his lips. That had felt good. The next morning, he slapped his manuscript down on the table and announced, "I'm going into town. Does anyone need anything?" Every eye was on the pile of paper. "What's that?" Branwen asked, coming over from the sink to look at it. "That," Ron said, putting on his jacket, "is my book, which I am shipping off to New York today." "The new Luddite Manifesto," Lisa read. "Congratulations, honey." She put her hand on his neck and reached up to kiss his cheek. Ron simply stared at her blankly. Since the big meeting, he'd been sleeping on the cot in his office. As far as he was concerned, there was no longer anything between them. The sooner she got used to that, the better for both of them. "So, no one needs anything?" he said to the group at large. They shook their heads, silenced by his coldness to Lisa. "Okay, bye." It wasn't until he was actually in the van that he realized he wasn't coming back. He was going to drive his manuscript to New York. He was going to hand-deliver it to the editor and make that man or woman listen to him. Because giving up on your dreams meant you were ready to lie down and die, and he was a long, long way from that. As far as Ron was concerned, he was leaving behind a house full of the walking dead. It was time to cut his losses and look to the future. As he drove past the house, the baby began to cry.